Hello there. In today's video I am going to be making a sword. The client requested a sword inspired by this example, which was sold by Easton Antique Arms. After some negotiation it was decided that the guard would be changed to steel and the decoration would be altered. The sword was to be made out of 5160 spring steel. It's difficult to find a place that sells this stuff in small quantities, so I think it's worth mentioning that I ordered it from Maritime Knife Supply. To begin with, I had to cut the bar. This always involves a little bit of guesswork, as you're going to be making the bar longer and thinner as you forge it. The sword was to have a blade of about 21 inches and a handle of about 6 inches. For convenience sake, I decided to cut the 4-foot bar in half so that I would have enough for 2 swords. This was ultimately a good decision, as I screwed up the heat treatment and broke my first attempt at the sword, having to start over. I'm trained as a knife maker, not a sword maker, and while the skills are related, they're not 100% transferable. I cut the bar in half using a chop saw. Make sure you wear goggles when doing this. Then into the fire. A proper sword maker's forge would have a much longer fire pot. This type of coal forge can only heat up a small portion of the blade at once, which isn't ideal. The blacksmith who uses a coal forge is always poking at the fire, rearranging the coal so that it burns properly. The camera doesn't pick up the colors of the metal very well. This looks bright white in the footage, but in reality it was bright orange. 5160 is slightly temperamental. You can destroy it if you work it too hot or too cold. It wants to be worked in the orange range, not hotter, not colder. To begin with, I'm going to be defining the tang of the sword, the portion that goes through the handle. I'm using a hardy tool to cut in the shoulders of the tang. A hardy cutter is like a chisel that fits into the square hole on the anvil. The metal is going to get thicker where I cut it, so every couple of blows I lay it flat to pound it down to the same thickness as the rest of the metal. I'm using the cross peen of the hammer here for a more precise strike so that I don't mess up the shoulders of the cut. Having defined the shoulders, I now have to thin out the tang. I lay the cut over the corner of the anvil and then work the metal down from there. As I make the tang thinner in one dimension, it is going to want to get thicker in the other, so every couple of blows I lay it flat and work it down to the same thickness as the original bar. 5160 is a bit of a pain to forge. It's very tough steel that doesn't like to move even when heated. The heat window is also narrower than other steels, so you don't get to work it for as long between heats. You really want to use your heaviest hammer for this application, or better yet have a power hammer, or better yet have a highly skilled assistant with a sledgehammer. Unfortunately, power hammers are very expensive and highly skilled assistants even more so. I made the handle fittings before this for my first failed attempt at making the sword. I don't want to have to remake the handle, so I'm going to leave the tang fairly chunky so I can grind it to fit these fittings perfectly. I just have to clean the tang up a little bit, make it perfectly straight, so I'm going to use a lighter hammer for this. Close enough for jazz. I am now going to anneal the tang by sticking it in the coal and then letting the fire die out on its own. By allowing the metal to cool down slowly, it relieves any stresses that the metal might have accrued during the forging. It also puts it down to a 0 hardness level so that it will be easier to grind. Coming back to this the next day, let's get to work on the tip. I'm going to pound one corner of the blade down to the other while leaving the other flat. The flat side will eventually become the cutting edge. Now I'm trying to make the blade a little bit longer and thinner towards the tip. We want a more even transition from the base to the tip. I also want to adjust the angle of the tip so that it's not quite as steep. Now I begin pounding the edge into the blade. You want to hold the piece and the hammer at a slight angle relative to the anvil so that it works it from both sides. You also want to flip it regularly. It's also a good idea to work the piece near the edge of the anvil so that if you miss, the corner of your hammer isn't going to be digging up your anvil's face. If the hammerhead starts to loosen, pound the handle against the anvil and everything will tighten up. We're going to carry on working our way down the blade. We want to work the edge to at least half of its original thickness, but we don't want to work it too thin, otherwise we won't have enough material left to grind out any hammer marks. You can see which parts of the edge are still thicker because the blade won't be quite as wide there. You want the blade to be an even width all the way down. The sword is also starting to curve from the edge being stretched more than the spine. It's starting to curve a little bit too much, so we're going to pound it a little bit flatter. The curvature is just going to keep increasing as you work down into the unforged section, so you want to be a little bit conservative, always straightening it out. I have a pattern drawn on the floor for the approximate shape I'd like the sword to take. As you can see, the degree of curvature overall is approximately right, but I've only forged half of the edge, so I'm going to have to straighten this out a little bit. The point is also a little bit chunky relative to what I'd like it to be. The client also requested a false edge, so I'm going to have to hammer that in. The false edge is going to change the angle of the tip slightly, so I'm going to increase the curvature before working on it. Now I start on the false edge, same thing but on the other side. It's very easy to completely screw up the geometry when forging in the false edge, so you want to leave it a little bit thicker and do most of the work on the grinder. The blade started to corkscrew a little bit, so I'm just going to tap it flat. Hit it firmly but not hard. Now back to the true edge. Every blow here is going to make the grinding a little bit easier. The blade is starting to take on a rather extreme degree of curvature, so I'm going to straighten this out. I do this by laying it diagonally across the anvil and then moving it back and forth as I tap it. You want to hit it very gently here so that you don't deform the edge. If it were thinner, I would be using a wooden hammer. Now I check it against my template on the floor to make sure everything's lined up nicely. Now I massage it with the hammer very gently to make sure that the blade is perfectly flat and straight. I then put the tip of the sword in the fire as it dies out and leave it there for a good 3 or 4 hours while it cools. Returning, I relight the fire and I can work on the next section. I wanted to flip the sword over so that I could hold it by the tip so my hand wouldn't be so close to the heated section. Because of how big they are, it's very awkward to use a set of tongs when forging a sword. I could have forged this portion of the edge on the first day when I did the tang, but I was lazy that day. Comparing the sword against the pattern, it's pretty close, but it's a little bit too long, so I'm going to have to move the shoulder of the tang in. This is no big deal. The tang always involves a lot of guesswork, and this time I guess I guessed wrong. I had to remove material there anyway. Before that, back in the fire to let the blade anneal. Before grinding, I'm going to go over the blade with a wire brush. This will remove the worst of the mill scale. Mill scale can often be quite a bit harder than the steel underneath, so if you can remove it, it will save you some lifespan on your sanding belts. Some people will instead soak the blade in a heavy acid to remove the mill scale completely. I don't like to work with acids because they're dangerous. I would rather put in a little bit extra work on the grinder and not melt my shoes. Next I'm going to use the bench grinder to better define and move the shoulders of the tang. You get the picture, I'm not going to bore you with the whole process here. Jumping into the future for the purpose of narrative, here I'm cutting the shoulders of the tang perfectly clean and flush with a file. This is why it's important to have annealed properly. If everything's nice and soft, this process will only take a couple of minutes. The guard, which I haven't made yet, should fit on nice and square now. Jumping back into the real timeline, we begin the worst stage of the process. I begin by using a slightly blunt belt. I'm just going to go over the whole thing very roughly and crudely to get off as much mill scale as possible. With that out of the way, I put on a fresh new belt and begin the grinding properly. A sword is a big project that requires a lot of grinding, so you're really going to want to use a sharp belt for this. Grinding is the worst because it's extremely time-consuming, it's extremely boring and repetitive, and yet at the same time it requires a huge amount of skill. You can't just zone out and daydream, you need to be paying attention, making all kinds of little micro adjustments, holding it at precisely the right angle. If your attention lapses and you slip, you might gouge the blade with the corner of the belt, which is going to take a lot of work to grind out. You need to keep track of how long you've been holding it in any given section. It's a slog. Surprisingly enough, it's also the most tiring portion. You aren't actually moving very much, but you're resisting a lot of motion in holding that blade steady on the grinder. Your legs are also absorbing a lot of the vibration from this machine. It's hard on the back too, because a lot of the movement that you're doing is with the whole body rather than just with the arms. The whole body makes it more stable. It is also the largest part of the whole process. The forging only takes about 2 hours, the grinding takes at least 6. Because the grinding is just an endless void, we're going to use the magic of time travel to jump to something more interesting. I'm going to start forging the crossguard. I'm starting with a piece of mild steel, which was originally going to be a door latch, but it never materialized into anything. If you don't have a half-finished door latch to start with, you could consider making one. I'm going to begin by tapering one end to make it longer and thinner so that I can use it as a knuckle bow. This is fairly straightforward. I don't have any special technique beyond heat it up and hit it. At one point the metal fell out of the tongs I was using to hold it. This is suboptimal. I do not recommend repeating it. It's getting pretty thin, so I'm going to call it there. For the next step I'm going to put a twist in the bar. I'm going to do this with a bending wrench, so this is just an adjustable wrench with a piece of flat stock spot welded to the end. I clamp one end of the heated section in a post vise, and then I slide the bending wrench onto the other end, throwing the regular tongs on the table in disgust. And then I twist the metal until it looks right. Using the same heat, I quickly transfer the bar over to the anvil and try and straighten it out, but not before readjusting the camera, but forgetting to readjust the focus. I should have used my wooden hammer here, but I didn't. I'm just trying to straighten it out, make it nice and flat, without disrupting the ridges of the twist. This looks pretty good. It'll make the guard look nicer than it would otherwise. I want to roll the very edge of the knuckle guard where it's going to intersect the pommel. Begin by very gently tapping it over the corner of the anvil, then turning it upside down and very gently tapping it backwards. Then turning it over and tapping it very gently back down again. Then back up and repeat, then back down and repeat. Now I lay it flat and make it all flush. A little bit more. There we go. The other end of the bar, what will become the rear quillon, already has a little bit of a ball shape, so I'm just going to emphasize this a little bit more on the grinder. I also want to take off any sharp corners and burrs. The reference piece had a shell guard to cover the back of the hand, so I'm going to forge this out of a piece of mild steel flat stock. To begin, I'm going to make it wider by forging it out with the cross-peen hammer. The cross-peen moves material mostly in one dimension and very little in the other. Then I switch over to a ball peen hammer in order to round things out and give it an appropriate texture. I'm going to have to cut this bar now, so I've got a piece of antler that I'm going to use for the handle, and I'm going to take account of the width. I'm also going to mark a piece to cut off that will form the pommel. Then back to the chop saw to make 2 little cuts. Heating up the newly cut portion of the shell guard to B, I am now rounding it out with the ball peen hammer. I'm trying to make the shell guard roughly sort of headless snowman shape. I'm roughly sort of trying to match the dimensions of a flat section on the quillon piece. Now I flip it over, heat up the big half again, and take it over to a swage block. This is going to give it more of the shell shape. A swage block is absolutely essential for doing any kind of 3-dimensional bending. It's really hard to make any kind of bowl shape without a swage block to help you. I think that's just about right. I'm quite happy with this. The next step is to bend the front quillon into a knuckle bow. Before I can do this, I need to mark where the bends should be. I got the piece of antler that will become the handle, so I can mark up how much clearance it needs and where the bends should be. Ideally, it should go something like this. Having heated up the piece, I first quench the rolled section so that it won't deform so easily if I have to hit it. I then stick the piece in the vise and bend it just by hand. I want the bend a little bit sharper than that, so I'm going to give it some taps with the hammer. See how it looks? That looks pretty good. Not quite right, but pretty good. I don't want to readjust my camera, so I'm just going to straighten things out on the post vise. There we go. That's looking better. The next bend needs to be in exactly the right spot. I'm not going to have much margin for error, so I'm going to mark it more securely with a hacksaw rather than just with chalk. Hacksaw marks don't rub off in the forge. Okay, heat it up, back in the post vise, same thing. Make sure it's in the right spot. It's going to be too hot to handle, so I'm going to use the tongs to bend it over. It didn't bend perfectly straight, so I'm going to get this over to the anvil quickly. Adjust the camera first, because everything's a hassle when you're filming. Come on, focus, work with me here. I've only got a couple seconds. There we go, that's looking pretty good. Quite happy with that. Now I'm going to take all the fittings over to the grinder and just clean up the edges a little bit. Take off all the sharp bits, all the burrs. Then they all go in the forge to anneal. This will make them softer and easier to file to fit the tang. It will also turn any of the shiny sections from the grinding black, which will make it look nicer and make it more resistant to rust. While that stuff is cooling down, I'm going to start work on the scabbard. I've never made a scabbard for a curved sword, so I'm just going to sort of improvise and see what comes out of this. First, I'm tracing the half-ground blade onto a piece of mystery softwood. Then I'm marking which section of the material is unnecessary. Then I'm tracing another line about 1/4 of an inch away from the main tracing to mark out the seam material. Here I'm going to cut away the unnecessary length. Then I cut the mouth of the piece perpendicular to the sword tracing. Now I use the table saw to remove a slice of unnecessary material from the edge of the piece. Having raised the blade up, I am now going to rip the piece in half. This will give me 2 slices for either side of the scabbard. The blade isn't high enough for me to do this all in one pass, and I don't have enough material to hold on to for me to do this safely in one pass, so I'm doing it in 4 sections, 1 in each quarter. If you're going to do it like this, you need to make sure that the depth is set correctly, otherwise you're going to end up with a piece that's thin on one side and thick on the other. I'm going to rip the excess piece that I cut off in half and use this for the inside of the scabbard. Now on the main pieces of the scabbard, I'm painting between the 2 traced lines with hide glue. Then fastening the thin piece on with clamps and bending it as I go. It's thin enough that it bends fairly easily. Then I put a little bit more hide glue on the seams in case there's some area that didn't get saturated properly, and then I'm going to just let it sit for 15 minutes. I then repeat the process on the other side. This piece had some grain runoff, so I had to do it in 2 sections instead. The tip is the most sharply curved section of the whole sword, and I found it very difficult to clamp everything nicely there. With everything clamped up, we then put the sword blade in and see if it will still fit. Good to check before it's too late to readjust. I then split the piece of antler down the middle with a hacksaw. I'm going to need to carve out a 3-dimensional shape to fit the tang inside the antler, and I wasn't sure how to do this apart from splitting it down the middle. I'm not happy with this choice as it made a visible seam in the finished product, but I don't know what else I could have done. One option I could have taken would be to have just drilled a hole straight through and to have made the tang perfectly round and cylindrical so that it would go through a straight hole. With the antler cut in half, I then mark out the material that needs to be removed to admit the tang. I then take the 2 pieces of antler, lay them end to end, and mark them so that I can be sure that the holes are in exactly the same spot. I'm going to start removing material by defining a barrier with the hacksaw. Just cut in a line as deep as I need to. Then I'm going to use a Dremel tool with a ceramic cutting bit. The ceramic cutting bit works really well for antler. You want to be really careful here and use the Dremel on its lowest setting because it's really easy to slip and screw this up. It wants to roll up over the sides of your cut. It doesn't want to stay in there. Then I clean things up with a slick chisel. Slick chisel, you're not hitting it with a mallet, you're just sliding it back and forth and scraping away the material with your own hands. Then we make sure that the two halves of the handle fit together nicely over the tang. Then I start marking up some of the metal fittings for drilling and filing. I'm using a drill press for this. If I had 3 hands I could do it in the forge, but the drill press works fine. Then I clean and square up the holes through the metal fittings. I'm using a set of needle files for this. You want your needle files to be clean and sharp. A piece of advice regarding needle files is that you should have a different set for different materials. Antler dust gums up the teeth of the needle files really quickly and makes them useless for metal, so get a different set for antler. The client didn't like the style of decoration of the original shell guard, so I said I'd do some simple punch and file work. Using a triangular needle file, I'm just going to cut some corners into this hole to make it a little 4-pointed star. This work goes by pretty quickly if the metal was annealed properly and the files are sharp. Returning to the handle proper. This piece of antler was the longest, straightest one that I had available, and it was a little bit too short for a proper saber handle, so I needed to make a spacer. First I marked a straight line and cut the antler off square relative to the crossguard. Then I set to making the spacer. I took a piece of scrap walnut and cut some slices from it. I also had an appropriately sized disc of antler that was left over from another project. I decided I was going to make a nice little section of stacked material. I really like combining antler and walnut. I think the colors contrast each other very nicely. To make them fit together nicely, I ground them perfectly flat with my smaller belt sander, the one that has a guide. I glued the 3 pieces together with Gorilla Glue. I don't really like using modern glues, but the handle is important enough that I'm prepared to compromise my principles. To make sure the holes lined up properly, I put the drill bit in the hole and then slotted everything together on top of it. What I should have done was glue them and then drill the hole, but sometimes you do things that don't make sense. At this point I also glued together the 2 halves of the antler handle. I forgot to film it though. While we're waiting for that to dry, let's return to the scabbard. I've got the whole thing painted up with hide glue and ready to sandwich the 2 halves together. Then I put a board on top of it along with a big chunk of oak and a big chunk of metal. Then I have to make sure I can still get the sword out. About 6 hours later, when everything had started to solidify, I went and started carving away the unnecessary material with my pocket knife. I should have waited 24 hours, as this broke some of the glue towards the mouth of the scabbard. I had to reinforce it with Gorilla Glue. Patience is the craftsman's primary virtue, and it's one that I don't always have. I used the draw knife for part of this. It's better for certain sections. I'm going to switch over and work on the spacer while I'm waiting for the Gorilla Glue to correct my impatience. I'm battening off the unnecessary material with my pocket knife and a soft wood mallet. Then I use the Dremel tool to widen the hole. I should have used a rasp for part of this, but I didn't. Then I shaped the spacer on the belt sander. Besides rounding it, I had to make one end of the spacer the same width as the crossguard while making the other end the same width as the antler. While I'm here, I can do the rest of the shaping on the scabbard. With the wooden core of the scabbard finished, I'm going to work on the leather cover. This is a scrap of 2-ounce veg tan leather that I had left over from another scabbard. It was already almost the right shape, so I just cut it to the right length. Not perfect, but it will stretch. I'm too lazy and cheap to get a new piece. The first thing I do is go over all of the seams with my hole marker. This is like a little spur that rolls along and puts a little divot into the leather. This allows me to make sure that the holes are all perfectly spaced. I'm going to go through and make all of those holes with an awl. Veg tan leather is very tough and difficult to sew without pre-punching the holes. I'm also going to be sewing it wet, so it's going to be too stretchy to make the holes even by eye. Then I soaked the leather in water for a couple of hours before I started sewing. The soaked leather is very stretchy, which allows me to make it tight around the wooden core. I'm sewing on top of a towel so that the water from the leather doesn't wreck the finish on my table, and also so that the leather doesn't pick up any stains from the table. It's important to make sure that your hands are clean when you're doing this. The wet leather picks up stains very easily. The last scabbard I did had lots of coal fingerprints on it. I'm sewing with a standard raised seam. A lot of people will use a butted seam here, but I don't see anything to recommend a butted seam. It just makes the sewing a lot harder. A standard seam also means that you don't have to cut your leather with absolute precision. It will stretch and you can make up the difference. Towards the tip, things weren't lining up nicely. I got too much material, so I'm just going to pinch it and then snip it off with some shears. Then to round it off so that it conforms nicely. Because I just cut away the prescribed path, I'm going to punch each hole one at a time before each stitch. This is very slow, but what have you, I've only got about 8 stitches left. Having finished the first pass of the seam, there's still a little bit excess material, so I'm just going to snip that off with the shears. Then I went back up the seam with a whip stitch. This will just make it a little bit nicer. Wet veg tan leather is very impressionable, so there are a lot of little marks left by where the needles or my fingernails touched it. So I'm just going to massage these out using the wooden handle of the awl. Later that day, after the leather has fully dried, I began treating it with oil. I used olive oil here because it's cheaper than neat's foot oil. Neat's foot oil would be a lot better. Other animal fat like mink oil or tallow would also be a lot better, but those take a long time to absorb. It would take me a week to do the full treatment, whereas olive oil I can do in a day. Because olive oil is fluid at room temperature, it will migrate throughout the leather, so you don't have to worry about any drips or oversaturating any parts. It will even out. The leather is going to lighten as it dries, so after a couple of hours I'm going to give it another coat and then a third. Just keep going until you're happy with the color. The scabbard is going to need a frog to attach it to a belt. The client and I didn't talk about a frog, so I'm going to do a very simple sort of removable one in case the client doesn't like it. I've got this misshapen little strip of leather here, so I'm just going to split it up about 4.5 inches or so. Then I folded the other end over and punched a pair of holes. Then I cut the corners off of the one end to make it nicer. I bring in my little anvil because I'm going to rivet the ends together to make the belt loop. These copper rivets are expensive, but I really like them. The copper washer is sized so that it won't fit naturally onto the rivet, so you have to drive it home with this tool. This is just a piece of steel with a hole drilled in it. Now the washer will be perfectly snug and won't go anywhere. Using my snips, I cut off the excess rivet. Then I peen the head of the rivet to lock the washer in place. You want to use a very, very light hammer for this, and you want to strike it very, very gently. Just use the weight of the hammer. Then you want to go over it again to knock off any sharp edges, just around the corners. I got the rivets in place, and then I soaked the leather for an hour, and now I'm going to fold it. I'm pressing the top of the belt loop so that it's flat there and not round. I'm also going to fold each of these tails at 90 degrees. These will wrap around the scabbard. There's a right way and a wrong way to fold these tails, and I'm not entirely sure I picked the right one. I don't know. After this, I'll leave it to dry and then give it some oil. Here I'm folding the tails over the scabbard. This is going to show me where the overlap is going to be and where I need to put the rivet. I'm going to mark a little divot where the rivet has to go. First one hole, and then the other. And then riveting, same process as before. Then I folded the loose tails over the inside of the rivet and trimmed them off with my pocket knife. I then held these in place with a set of 2 stitches. This will protect the leather of the scabbard from the inside of the rivet. It also looks quite nice. In order to keep the frog from sliding off, I'm going to have to add a reinforcement for the mouth of the scabbard. I'm very annoyed that I didn't have a suitable piece of scrap lying around for this. I hate cutting new leather. This piece needs to be just big enough to go around the mouth of the scabbard, so I'll cut it to length. Punch 4 holes for 3 stitches. then sew it up nice and tight. Then I soak it, and now I'm going to stretch it over the mouth of the scabbard. It should shrink as it dries and become nice and tight. It would be naive to rely on friction alone to hold everything in place, so I'm going to put in a couple of tiny copper nails. These nails are just barely long enough to reach the wooden core of the scabbard. Before driving them, I'm putting in a wooden spacer so that I don't accidentally crush the scabbard. These nails are very soft and delicate, so I'm not pounding them in, I'm just pressing them in with the face of the hammer. This reinforcement creates a little lip which will prevent the belt frog from sliding off of the scabbard. Returning to the sword itself, I've just about finished the overall grinding, so I'm going to start putting on the edge. I like to do this by hand with an extremely coarse set of files. This allows me perfect precision on the edge. Sometimes when I do it with the grinder, it ends up a little bit wavy. I'm also going to do a lot of the work on the false edge here, as the files will allow me to give them a nice sharp shoulder. With that done, I'm going to grind in the fullers. I don't have a good technique for it. This is a technique that was recommended to me by a blacksmith I know. I'm using a chop saw here. The board will act as a guide. Sliding it through will keep the fuller nice and straight. I should have cut the board more precisely to fit the sword. As things were, there were a couple of sections that turned out kind of ugly. I was worried about the sword getting stuck because this is an extremely dangerous operation. Worst case scenario is that the sword could get jammed and dragged by the saw blade, in which case it might bring your arm with it into the grinder. Pushing the sword through from the other direction would be even more dangerous because then if it jammed it could throw it into your stomach. To mitigate the danger, I wore cut-resistant gloves, leather sleeves, and I handled it very loosely with my longest pair of tongs. If it does get thrown, I'd rather lose my grip on it than get pulled into the blade. This is a very stupid technique that I probably won't be repeating. Do not try this at home. I'm just about done grinding. All that's left to do is get it down to the appropriate weight. Taking it into the kitchen scale, the blade weighs a little over 1.5 pounds, and the blade plus the handle fittings weigh a little bit less than 2.5 pounds. This is a little bit heavier than I would have liked, but it's fine. Sliding all of the handle fittings onto the tang, I then sort of handle the sword and see how it feels. Does it feel right? Is the balance point acceptable? When everything is acceptable, then I go over it again very quickly with successively finer grains of sanding belt. After that was finished, it was time for the heat treatment. Recording this narration, I can feel my heart rate increasing just thinking about the process. Heat treatment is the last stage, it's the easiest to screw up, and when you screw it up, it tends to be catastrophic. It's stressful under the best of circumstances, but here even more so. I'm not particularly skilled or experienced at forging swords. My shop is not equipped for heat treating swords. I'm not familiar with this steel particularly. And I already screwed up this process a couple of days ago and destroyed my original attempt at this sword. Heat treatment is one of those areas in blacksmithing that is subject to a lot of magical thinking. Every blacksmith has got their own sets of rituals which are often quite different from one another. Before you begin, you go through your magic spell book and you select the ritual that you think is going to be most appropriate to the steel you're trying to heat treat. Then you follow the steps, hope for the best, and hope you didn't forget any steps. You also don't ever get to really know how good a job you did. You get to know when you fail, but never when you succeed. Every type of steel requires a slightly different ritual, and if you combine the wrong two, it's going to explode in a puff of smoke. The ritual I'm most familiar with only works with simple steels. If I try it with this spring steel, it will just crack. Because I'd already screwed up and blown up my first sword, I made the executive decision that I was not going to film this. I don't need the extra stress of trying to keep everything in focus and man the camera. If I'm going to have the best chance at succeeding, I need to be able to put 100% of my focus into what I'm doing. Besides that, my ritual for heat treating 5160 isn't very good, and you would probably be better served by looking up anybody else's technique on the internet. The first stage of the heat treat is fairly easy, so I'll share that process. It's called normalizing. What you're doing in this stage is you want to heat the sword up to an even temperature all throughout. This is easier if you have a propane forge, but in my little coal forge I have to keep moving it back and forth. Then you pull it out and let it air cool until all the color's gone when you turn out the lights. You want to repeat this process 3 times. This will reduce the size of the grain within the steel. It will also make the grain the same size without, making it less likely to crack when you quench it. You rejoin me after I've finished the quenching and tempering. I didn't do a great job here. It turned out a little bit softer than I would have liked, but any heat treatment that the piece survives is a successful heat treatment. Besides, I tend to prefer swords that are a little bit soft. It's better that the edge gets dented than that the sword breaks. Now I have to polish the sword clean again. For this, I'm going to use a high grit belt that's had all the teeth worn off. This belt is so badly worn that I can touch my fingers to it without any ill effect. Now the maker's mark. I broke my stamp for my maker's mark not so long ago, so I'm going to do this with a tiny little engraving tool. This is easier anyway. Here are all the metal filings that came off the sword during the grinding. I'm tempted to gather it all up and weigh it, but I don't think I'd like the result. Second to last stage, attaching the handle. I got the blade wrapped in leather so that the vise won't scuff it up. I'm also using a carpentry vise because it's got wider jaws with more surface area. Slot the pieces on, making sure that I've got them in the right orientation. It would be a shame to rivet the handle on but have everything backwards. Bit of Gorilla Glue because why not? Better safe than sorry. Gorilla Glue is really handy, but I hate it because it always gets on my hands and then I end up with dirt glued to my hands until the skin comes off. I should have cut the tang a little bit shorter before I glued everything on, but sometimes you're an idiot, so I'm going to cut it off here as it is. This is a useful test of the hardness of the tang. If it's too hard to saw, it's too hard to peen. Now I peen over the tang like a rivet. This is a useful test of how good a job you did tempering the blade. There's a lot of vibration here, and if you didn't temper the blade enough, it will just break under the stress. Once the handle is secured and the glue is dried, then it's time for the final stages, which is the hand polishing. There's nothing really to say here, just go over it with fine grit sandpaper until all the lines disappear or you run out of patience. Postscript. This would have been the end of things, but my client reminded me that I had missed a very important step. I forgot to forge in the distal taper. Distal taper is where the sword gets thinner from hilt to tip. This is very frustrating and I feel like a bit of an idiot because if I'd remembered to do this during the forging stages, it would have taken me literally 4 minutes and 26 seconds. As things stood, I had to go back to the grinder, mess up my nice polish, and remove some material. It was also more difficult than if I had done it during the initial grinding. Because the material has been heat treated, it's much harder to remove material. I also can't let it get too hot or I risk wrecking the heat treat. This is one of those areas where my knife maker instincts lead me astray. When you're forging a knife, distal taper kind of happens automatically just through the hammering and the grinding. It doesn't happen automatically with a sword because of the length. Oh well, because of my sins I suffered an unnecessary hour of grinding. Hardly the end of the world. After the grinding, the sword is 6 mm at the ricasso and 4 mm just below the false edge. This represents a decrease of about 30% along the sword's length, which is about what you want for a cutting sword. Here we see the finished product. It looks quite nice, I think you will agree. The only issue is that I screwed up one of the fullers, which is kind of messy. Whatever, it adds character. The final weight is a little over 2¼ pounds. The scabbard 2 turned out pretty nice. I'm very happy with this. The whole project took about 12 hours, not counting the time I was waiting for glue to dry or the first failed attempt. May as well have a little bit of fun, see how it handles before I mail it off. I've never handled a sword like this before, so it feels very weird. It feels very novel in the hand. I'm used to fencing with rapiers, and this doesn't feel at all like a rapier. It doesn't appreciate the sort of short, abrupt motions that a rapier favors, rather it wants continuous circular motion. I think it's safe to say I'm not very good with this type of sword. Enough of this frivolity. Well, now that everything's finished, time to look at it one last time before I say goodbye. Then to wrap it up very badly in wrapping paper. Then roughly cram it into a box and off to the post office. I hope my client's happy with it, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thank you.